finished our unit on genetics and all that sort of stuff. Our new unit is going to dive into the relationship between DNA, RNA, and proteins and how that whole sort of process works. How do we take the information in DNA and make it into our observable traits that we see in every one of us? And to me, there's no better way to explain that than to talk about viruses. Starting in the 1960s, there was a sort of debate among biologists about how we should view evolution. Namely, the question they were asking is, what is the thing that really evolves? Or another way to put the question, whose perspective should we look at evolution from? Should we look at evolution from the population level? Maybe we should look at it in the individual. But the view that has kind of won out since that time is that we should be looking at evolution from the perspective of the gene. And remember, a gene is just a segment of DNA that determines your traits. This might not seem like such a big deal, but I have a little bit of an analogy for you to kind of put things into perspective, right? Think about chicken and eggs. We could say that the egg is just a chicken's way to make more chickens, but at the same time, we can completely flip that way of viewing things around. We can say that a chicken is just an egg's way of making more eggs. In the same way, we can pose the question like this: is DNA our body's way of making more bodies? Or is our bodies just DNA's way of making more DNA? And so that bottom way of thinking about things is really the gene-centric view of evolution. It's evolution from the perspective of the gene. One scientist who is really influential in this sort of selfish gene way of looking at evolution is Richard Dawkins. In his book, The Selfish Gene, he says replicators, genes, are packaged in huge colonies, individual bodies. But the individual body, so familiar to us on our planet, did not have to exist. The only kind of entity that has to exist in order for life to arise anywhere in the universe is the immortal replicator. In other words, the gene. And so this sort of chicken and egg thing is exactly what Dawkins is talking about here. He's saying that we should view evolution from the perspective of the gene. And what that means is that our bodies are just our DNA's way of making more DNA. The thing that really is evolving is our DNA, not us. Now, just a little bit of a fun tidbit here. This book, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, is actually where the term meme came from. So the memes you see on the internet, ultimately, sort of, the idea traces their root back to Richard Dawkins. I can think of no better example of selfish DNA than viruses. And in order to help you understand how viruses work, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. So imagine that there's a small businessman and he doesn't have very much money. He's just kind of starting. He doesn't have a lot of wealth, but he has this great idea for a dinosaur toy. And so he's thinking to himself, how can I mass produce this dinosaur toy? I don't have the money to do it. So then he gets an idea. He says, I will make a fake security card, and that security card will get me into the local factory. Let's say it's a factory that makes printers or cars or something like that. But anyways, he makes a fake security card to get into the factory. And then once he's inside of the factory, he takes all of the plans, all of the blueprints, all of the information to make his toy, and he saves it onto a flash drive, a USB drive. And then he uploads that information to make his toy to the computers at the factory. So what he's doing here is he's secretly going into the factory and hijacking the factory's equipment to make his own toys. He's kind of rewriting or reprogramming the assembly line to make his toys instead of the thing that the factory was actually made for. What you can see here is that this businessman is kind of a sly guy. He's kind of a trickster, because what he's doing is he's hijacking somebody else's machinery to make his own stuff. He didn't build the factory. He didn't pay for the factory. He just snuck in and took advantage of the factory machinery while no one was looking. And viruses actually work the same way. If we look at the structure of a virus, the structure of a virus is really simple. It's made out of a protein shell, and then there's little smaller proteins along the outside of that shell that are called entry proteins. And then inside of that protein shell is just some DNA. Kind of an analogy I like to use is that proteins are just a box with DNA inside of it. And in fact, I've made my own model of a virus. Here, I have a box. It's made out of protein. I have these little smaller proteins on the outside that serve as entry proteins. And then if I look inside the box, all I have is some DNA. And that's really all viruses are. They don't have cells, they don't have organelles, aren't nearly as complex as the cells that you and I have. They're just boxes with DNA inside of them. Not all viruses have DNA inside of them. Some viruses, such as the coronavirus that we're dealing with right now, actually has RNA inside of its protein coat instead of DNA. So if viruses aren't living, how are they able to replicate? And the way they do this is they do something a lot similar to the businessman that I talked about earlier who hijacked the factory. The first thing that happens is that the virus has to gain entry into the host cell. This might be my cell or someone else's cells, but the first thing that has to happen is the virus has to get into the cell. And it does this by using its entry protein to kind of bind onto a cell receptor, and that tricks the cell into letting the virus in. So, once the virus is in, it's going to take its own DNA and then inserts it into your DNA. It takes its virus DNA and kind of sneaks it in to the nucleus and rearranges it with your own DNA. Now, once the virus DNA is inside of your nucleus, your cell actually copies the DNA just like it would its own DNA. Your cell machinery can't really tell the difference between viral DNA and your own DNA, so it just copies all of it. Now, once those copies of viral DNA are floating inside of your nucleus, then that DNA is converted, it's copied into RNA. So remember, RNA is single-stranded. It's kind of like DNA, so it can hold the same information as DNA. It's just now in an RNA form. And then what happens next is that RNA leaves the nucleus and is used to make proteins. And remember, the virus is made out of proteins, so that RNA leaves the nucleus. It's used to make more protein, which is what the viruses are made out of. And then once these viruses have been constructed inside of your cells, they have a jailbreak. They just completely break out of the cell, and then they can go on to infect other cells, and the process just keeps going and going and going. Like I said before, viruses are just the perfect example of selfish DNA. They're not even alive. They're just pieces of DNA that figured out how to get into your cells and trick you into making more of them. As it turns out, viruses have made a pretty huge mark on human evolution. About the year 1999 or 2000, the Human Genome Project completed. And what the Human Genome Project did is it looked at every single letter of the DNA in humans, and they found something actually really quite startling. They found that about 8% of the DNA in your body is actually not your DNA. It's DNA that actually came from a virus that infected not you, but one of your ancestors. So one of your ancestors, maybe 1,000 or 100,000 years ago, got infected by a virus, and they passed down that DNA to their children, so on and so forth. So inside of you right now is DNA from viruses which infected humankind thousands and thousands of years ago. Like I said, it's like 8% of your entire genome, which is a lot. There's even some evidence that this ancient viral DNA has been in the human genome so long that it actually might kind of help us or play a role in our development or something like that. There are a couple of studies that have shown that viral DNA actually kind of gets expressed specifically during fetal development, whenever a fetus is in the womb developing into a baby. And hopefully you've caught on to why viruses are so difficult to kill. They're so difficult to kill because they're not alive in the first place. At least they're certainly not alive in the sense that we would think of it. But what's interesting here is that they're capable of evolving and changing and adapting because they're made out of DNA, just like we are. One of my favorite sort of scientific discoveries from the last 5 years was this team of scientists who unearthed an ancient DNA virus frozen in some permafrost 30,000 years ago. These scientists were able to revive the 30,000-year-old virus and still get it to infect other cells. As we go further into this unit, we're going to keep referring back to the life cycle of a virus and how it works, and hopefully you'll get to learn a little bit about what's going on in our world that you can apply to current events. Remember, we've got Zoom sessions from 9:30 to 10 every Tuesday and Thursday, and you can email me or Mrs. Cook if you have any questions. See ya.